At 76, Charles finally admitted what so many had suspected for decades. He was already considered the trash of the royal family even before those words ever left his lips. His life had been built on denial, deception, and carefully planned propaganda. Watch this video till the end to find why Charles has revealed everything at this age and how everything was related to his ex-wife and the weight of a crown he hadn't yet worn. Born in November 1948, Charles came into a family that demanded loyalty to duty above loyalty to oneself. From the very beginning, his mother, Elizabeth, was not just a mother. She was the queen. The woman who tucked him into bed at night was the same woman who disappeared for months on Commonwealth tours, leaving Charles in the care of nannies. His father, Prince Philip, tried to mold him into steel by sending him away to Gordonstoun, which was a known brutal boarding school in Scotland, where he was bullied, mocked, and humiliated. In private letters, Charles described it as hell on earth. These scars never left him. They taught him early that emotions had no place in his life, and yet those very suppressed emotions would later explode in the most scandalous way possible. The world saw Charles grow into a man, but they never saw the child who was desperate for affection. That lack of warmth would guide every relationship he ever had. When he was young, before Diana, before Camilla, Charles was already known in elite circles for dating constantly. At least 20 serious relationships passed through his life before he ever settled down. Actresses, aristocrats, celebrities, each one carefully used and discarded because none of them was enough. Why? Because Charles was never allowed to marry for love. He was expected to marry for the monarchy. By the late 1970s, the pressure was unbearable. His uncle, Lord Mountbatten, pushed him toward finding a suitable bride. Suitability meant youth, purity, and aristocratic ties, and that is where Diana Spencer entered. A shy teenager, barely out of her childhood, Diana fit the requirements. What the world didn't know, at least not then, was that Charles was already in love with someone else. It was none other than his ex, Camilla, the woman who would ruin so many lives, the woman who would trigger the biggest crisis in modern royal history. When Charles proposed to Diana in February 1981, the engagement interview itself revealed what most people ignored. When asked if they were in love, Diana replied instantly, "Of course." Charles hesitated. Then came his infamous line, "Whatever in love means." That wasn't a slip of the tongue. It was a warning no one took seriously. The wedding in July 1981 was broadcast to 750 million people around the world. A fairy tale, they called it. But behind palace walls, it was closer to a funeral march. Diana had found a bracelet Charles had commissioned for Camilla just days before the wedding. He gave it to her, engraved with the letters G and F, which referred to Gladys and Fred, their pet names for each other. Diana confronted him, but the machine of monarchy was bigger than her pain. She was told to shut up and keep silent. This silence carried into their marriage. Charles kept in contact with Camilla, denying it to everyone, including Diana. But the truth always leaves a trail. Phone calls, secret meetings, gifts. The press began to circle. Diana herself felt trapped. Years later, she admitted that the day she walked down the aisle, she already knew she was marrying 3 people. The cracks became public by the mid-1980s. Diana suffered from bulimia, fueled by stress, loneliness, and betrayal. Charles grew cold, more distant, turning fully toward Camilla. Their private conversations, recorded and leaked, became some of the most humiliating scandals in royal history. The one that the public never forgot was the Camilla Gate tape, published in 1993. In it, Charles was heard telling Camilla he wished he could live inside her trousers, even joking that he wanted to be reincarnated as her tampon. We will tell you in more detail about it later, but for the monarchy, it was shameful on a scale they had never faced before. For Charles, it was exposure of the very secret he had tried to hide for decades. But what the public didn't know was how deep this went. The tapes were not just embarrassing. They revealed that Charles had never intended to give Camilla up, not even for his wife, not even for his country. He risked it all. And as more details surfaced, questions were asked. Why was Diana, the most photographed woman in the world, spiraling into despair while Charles was openly, defiantly pursuing Camilla? Why was the monarchy willing to sacrifice Diana to protect Charles? And how far would Charles go to keep the truth buried? When things were breaking down, the public was given the excuse that Charles and Diana were simply incompatible. But that word doesn't explain the betrayal Diana lived through, nor does it explain why the Queen herself stepped in, demanding their separation in 1992. This was not incompatibility. This was a marriage destroyed by a love affair Charles refused to end. And here is where the story begins to go crazy. Because the question remained, when Charles was keeping up appearances, even after this all happened, what was Charles really protecting? His reputation or something larger? After decades, when Charles finally admitted what we suspected, it wasn't just about Camilla. It was about the institution, the cover-ups, and the painful cost of silence. But before we can reach that confession, we must discover every hidden layer that brought him to that point. The moment Charles inherited the crown, his past stopped being shadows behind palace walls and became history carved into the throne itself. What Britain had quietly suspected for decades was now impossible to avoid. Charles was not the fairy tale king his mother had tried to sell him as, nor was he the heroic prince of youth. He was the monarch of scandal, built by betrayal and haunted by the woman the world loved more than him. Every scandal Charles had endured seemed to reappear the day he was crowned. From the moment Diana's funeral silence fell over Britain, there had been a growing unease about what role he had played in her unhappiness. The world still remembers Diana's famous interview in 1995, when she admitted that there were 3 of us in this marriage. That sentence had cut Charles's public image deeper than any tabloid ever could. And yet, what many did not know at the time was that Charles had already been caught in an even darker humiliation that the palace tried desperately to bury. It all started with Charles and Camilla, so let's go into more detail about it. In 1993, the world was stunned by the leak of a private phone call between Charles and Camilla. The press called it Camilla Gate or Tampon Gate, and the details were so graphic that newspapers debated whether they could even print them. Charles had been recorded late at night, telling Camilla he wished to be reincarnated as her underwear, confessing in language so intimate that it shocked even loyal royalists. It was not just crude imagery. It was the proof that while Diana was trying to look happy, while the country desperately wanted to believe in their fairy tale marriage, Charles's heart and body were already somewhere else. For many Britons, this was not only a scandal, it was a betrayal of the monarchy's dignity itself. But the affair was not only an affair, it was the visible wound of a much deeper truth. Charles had chosen Camilla long before the crown, long before Diana, long before duty. In the early 1970s, he had met her and fallen almost immediately. Yet the palace, led by Lord Mountbatten, and the Queen Mother disapproved. They saw Camilla as unsuitable, too experienced, too unpolished, too dangerous to the spotless image required of the future king. So Charles was steered away, and when Diana appeared as a young, innocent, untouched beauty, she was not just chosen as a bride, she was chosen as a symbol, the perfect future queen, carefully constructed to patch the cracks that Charles had already left behind. But symbols cannot live like people, and Diana was forced to discover that truth in real time. On her honeymoon, she found Charles's cufflinks engraved with the initials C and C, a gift from Camilla. Later, she recalled seeing photographs, notes, and knowing deep down that the marriage had been compromised before it had even begun. When Diana confronted Charles about Camilla, his response was as cold as it was final. "I refuse to be the only Prince of Wales who never had a mistress." That sentence alone told the world who Charles truly was. Yet what the public rarely hears is the extent of the rivalry inside the palace walls. Diana was adored outside Buckingham Palace, but inside she was viewed as a disruption. Courtiers talked behind her back that she was emotional, unstable, and uncontrollable. But what they never admitted was that her emotional tendencies were fed directly by the betrayal she endured. Watching her husband flaunt his love for another woman while denying her the partnership she had been promised. The marriage became a war zone of jealousy and heartbreak. Diana developed bulimia, spoke openly about her despair, and sought love elsewhere because love at home had been denied to her. And all of this bled into Charles's relationship with his sons. William and Harry were children, caught in a firestorm they did not light. They adored their mother, yet were heirs to the man who had humiliated her. In later years, Harry himself admitted the scars ran deep, that he resented how his mother had been treated, and that Camilla's eventual marriage to Charles left wounds that never truly healed. But still, Charles pushed forward. Despite the scandals, despite the divorces, despite Diana's tragic death in 1997, he fought to rewrite the narrative. He slowly reintroduced Camilla to the public, reshaped her image, and against all odds, convinced the establishment to accept her. In 2005, he married her. Yet even then, the announcement carried one of the greatest unspoken truths in royal history. Camilla would never be called Queen. She would only ever be Queen Consort. It was the palace's way of shielding Diana's memory, acknowledging that the public would never forgive Charles if the woman he betrayed, Diana, sat on the throne. But time has a way of rewriting memory. By the time Elizabeth II passed in 2022, Camilla had been softened in the public eye, quietly accepted, and on Charles's coronation day, she was crowned queen beside him. For millions who remembered Diana's tears, it was a moment that stung. For Charles, it was the fulfillment of the choice he had made all those years ago. Not the crown first, not the country first, but Camilla. And when he was asked, in interviews approaching his 76th year, what love truly meant to him, Charles finally admitted what had long been clear: Camilla had always been the one. By the time Charles reached his 50s, the fractures inside his family were impossible to disguise. The fairy tale of his marriage had collapsed publicly. Diana had died under circumstances that left the world unsettled, and the shadow of Camilla lingered heavier than ever. But what most don't realize is how brutally those years tested Charles, not just as a man, but as the heir who had already waited longer than any other in British history to ascend the throne. The palace could control ceremonies and appearances, but it could not erase the scandals that kept bleeding out. But Charles was never one to walk away from duty, no matter how battered his name became. Instead, he dug into his passions, architecture, environmentalism, and his charity work with the prince's trust. He tried to reframe himself as a man with vision, someone who could modernize a monarchy at risk of becoming irrelevant. Yet no speech, no ribbon cutting, and no tree planting could make people forget what they had heard on that tape. For years, Camilla was hidden away at royal events. She entered through side doors, left through back exits, and was never seen standing beside him in official portraits. The palace feared that one wrong step would reignite public fury. Still, time shifted public memory, and Charles understood how to wait. Slowly, he rehabilitated both his image and Camilla's, relying on persistence and an undeniable fact: she never left him. Unlike his failed marriage with Diana, his bond with Camilla stayed strong. And in its strange way, that consistency softened the edges of scandal. By the early 2000s, he had taken the risk to bring her out into the open, appearing with her at events and allowing the cameras to see what insiders already knew: that they were inseparable. But the silence surrounding Diana's death never disappeared. Questions kept resurfacing. Why had the marriage been allowed to deteriorate so disastrously in the first place? Why had Charles not fought harder for her, or perhaps for his family's acceptance of the woman he loved before marrying Diana at all? Even as he rebuilt his public standing, those doubts clung to him. When Diana's famous 1995 Panorama interview was later revealed to have been manipulated by deceptive tactics from journalist Martin Bashir, Charles's defenders argued he had been treated unfairly. Yet the truth remained that the emotional damage was done. Millions saw Diana's tears, her pain, and her words about being trapped in a system designed to crush individuality. And at the center of it was Charles. So, what happens to a man when he spends half his life waiting to be king while the world debates if he even deserves it? Charles carried that question silently. He admitted years later, in rare interviews, how suffocating the press attention had been, how he felt misunderstood and misrepresented. But even those confessions never erased the perception that he had failed Diana. The public could forgive his eccentricities, his strange remarks about architecture, even his tampon joke. What they could not fully forgive was how his pursuit of Camilla had cost Diana her happiness. And yet, by his 70s, Charles finally had what he had always wanted: Camilla by his side officially, no longer hidden, no longer shamed, and most surprisingly recognized as Queen Consort after Elizabeth's passing. For decades, he had been told the public would never accept her, but they did. It was as if the monarchy itself had rewritten the script, smoothing over the scandal and presenting their union as destiny fulfilled. Still, at 76, when Charles began speaking more candidly about his past, it was not triumph in his voice. It was an acknowledgement. He admitted the failures, the shortcomings, the pain he had caused. He confessed what everyone had suspected: that his marriage to Diana was never the fairy tale it was sold to be, that his love for Camilla had never ended, and that the crown itself had forced him into choices that scarred them all. It was not an apology to the public as much as it was a recognition of the truth. After everything we have told you, you might start to see that the story of Charles had always been wrapped in undisclosed drama. But when he turned 76, silence was no longer possible. In a private address that slipped into public knowledge, he finally gave voice to the one truth Britain had whispered for decades. He confirmed that his heart had never belonged to Diana, not fully, not in the way the world needed it to. And with that confession, everything shifted. But before that revelation, one final chapter needed reckoning. For years, Charles's loyalty to Camilla was not just a private affair, it was a public humiliation. The monarchy had always been built on secrecy, but now secrecy was impossible. After Diana died in 1997, when the nation wept for the princess, Charles faced open fury. Crowds booed him, letters flooded newspapers demanding he never become king. And Camilla, the woman he had fought to protect, had to be hidden away for years, unable to stand beside him. That resentment, the sense that Charles had chosen desire over duty, haunted him for the rest of his life. So why, at 76, admit it at last? Because the truth had already corroded the institution. Because no matter how carefully the palace had managed his image, the stain of the past remained. He knew history would not remember him as a warrior king, or a reformer, or even as a quiet monarch. He would be remembered for a single choice: the rejection of Diana and the unwavering devotion to Camilla. But his admission carried something deeper. In confirming that Diana was sacrificed to an arrangement he never wanted, Charles unintentionally validated what Diana herself had told the world back in 1995. There were 3 of us in this marriage. For decades, the establishment had tried to dismiss that statement as emotional exaggeration. Yet in 2024, the king himself vindicated her. And suddenly, Diana's ghost stood taller than ever, her words echoing across a Britain that never stopped loving her. That is what made the confession so devastating. It wasn't just about adultery or about a marriage gone wrong. It was about betrayal on the grandest stage, betrayal of a woman, betrayal of sons, betrayal of a nation that had invested its hope in a fairy tale. Charles had concealed it for decades, but at 76, he finally admitted what everyone already suspected. Diana was right. And here, the story folds back to William and Harry, the boys who walked behind their mother's coffin while Charles marched in silence. For them, the admission meant more than historical vindication. It meant living with the weight of their father's guilt. William, bound to inherit the throne, has always carried himself with reserve, rarely addressing the pain directly. Harry, by contrast, tore it open with interviews and memoirs, insisting that the monarchy had never atoned for what it put his mother through. Now, with Charles's words, their divisions found a cruel center. William sought to protect the crown from further collapse. Harry demanded accountability, and both were left with the same truth. Their father had finally admitted it. But the question remains, why now? Was it a moment of honesty, or was it on purpose? Maybe as an attempt to secure Camilla's legitimacy in the twilight of his reign. Because alongside the confession came another bold statement. He defended Camilla, called her his true companion, and insisted the nation see her not as the villain of Diana's story, but as the queen consort who had stood by him through every storm. The same woman mocked in tabloids, despised for years, now sat at his side in the gilded halls of Buckingham Palace. And Charles wanted Britain to accept that it had always been hers. Still, the shadow of Diana cannot be erased. Every time her face appears on murals or her words resurface in documentaries, Charles's confession echoes behind them. For the first time, there is no denial left, no spin to control the narrative. The fairy tale marriage was a lie. The truth was suppressed. The monarchy will continue. William will rise, Kate will step into the role of queen, and history will keep moving forward. But the truth has already reshaped the story. Charles will not be remembered for the coronation, nor for his speeches, nor for his causes. He will be remembered as the king who finally admitted what the world had known all along, that love for Camilla defined him, and the loss of Diana condemned him. And that, perhaps, is the tragedy. At the end of his life, in the twilight of the throne, Charles's legacy is not sovereignty, not stability, but confession. The words he spoke at 76 will outlive him, binding his reign forever to the woman he betrayed and to the woman he could never let go. History does not forget,